My name is Evelyn Ross. I was 22 years old the night my own family slapped me across the face and told me to leave as if I had never existed. I remember my age because that was the moment time split in two. The girl I was before and the woman I would become after. The sound of my mother's hand against my cheek echoed louder than her words, louder than my father's silence, louder than the door when it closed behind me. I stood there, barefoot on the cold pavement, my suitcase half empty, my heart completely shattered, realizing that blood did not mean protection and home did not mean safety. I had been crying long before the slap came, crying because I was tired of apologizing for breathing, for dreaming, for loving someone they disapproved of, for not being the obedient version of me they wanted to display. When my mother told me I was a disgrace, I tried to explain myself. When my father looked at me like a stranger, I begged him to say something, anything. Instead, he nodded when she told me to get out. That nod hurt more than the slap. It told me I was alone. I walked down the street with tears blurring the city lights, replaying every moment that led to that night. I had grown up believing love was conditional, that I had to earn my place by being quiet, useful, grateful. I had learned early that disappointment lived permanently in my parents' eyes, but I never imagined they would actually erase me. As the night swallowed me whole, I kept asking myself one question. How does a family unlove their own child so easily? I spent that first night sitting on a bus stop bench, hugging my knees, pretending I wasn't shaking from fear. I had no plan, no money worth mentioning, and nowhere to go. Every car that passed felt like a reminder that the world was moving forward while I had been thrown out of mine. I checked my phone obsessively, half hoping someone would call and say it was all a mistake. No one did. The silence confirmed what the slap had already said. By morning, my face was swollen, my eyes hollow, but something else had settled inside me too. A quiet determination I didn't recognize yet. I promised myself I would survive, even if survival felt like betrayal to the people who wanted me gone. I didn't know then that this promise would lead me somewhere unimaginable, toward a life that would one day force my family to look at me with regret instead of judgment. The first weeks were brutal. I slept on couches, in cheap rooms that smelled like bleach and loneliness, and sometimes I didn't sleep at all. I took any job I could find, learned to smile while my chest ached, learned how to disappear in plain sight. Every rejection hardened me, every small victory kept me breathing. I told myself pain was temporary, even when it felt endless. It was during one of those exhausting days when I thought I had nothing left to give that I met Miles Turner. I didn't know his name then. I only knew the way he looked at me, not with pity or curiosity, but with a quiet respect that made me uncomfortable. I was used to being judged or ignored, not seen. That first encounter was brief, almost insignificant on the surface, yet it left a strange warmth in my chest that scared me more than loneliness ever had. I didn't realize it that night, but meeting Miles was the beginning of a new fracture in time. Another before and after. And just like the night my family threw me out, I had no idea how deeply this moment would reshape my life or how much it would eventually cost us both. I met Miles Turner in a place where people usually didn't look at each other for more than a second. It was a small cafe tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore, the kind of place where exhaustion hung in the air heavier than the smell of coffee. I was working there part-time, my hands constantly trembling from fatigue, my mind split between staying polite and staying upright. That morning, I had barely slept. My cheek still burned with the memory of my mother's hand, even though the mark had already faded. Miles came in quietly, like someone who didn't want to disturb the world. He ordered the simplest thing on the menu and waited patiently, scrolling through his phone but never fully disappearing into it. When I handed him his cup, our fingers brushed, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not comfort, but calm. He looked at me, really looked, and said thank you in a way that didn't rush past me. It was such a small thing, but it stayed with me long after he left. He started coming back every few days. Sometimes he worked on his laptop in the corner. Sometimes he just sat and watched the street through the window. We exchanged polite smiles, then brief conversations. Nothing personal, nothing dangerous. I didn't tell him about my family or my nights spent crying into borrowed pillows. I didn't ask him why his eyes always seemed heavier than his words. We were two strangers circling each other carefully, both afraid of stepping too close to something fragile. One afternoon, when the cafe was almost empty, he asked me my name. When I told him, he repeated it softly, like he wanted to remember it properly. I asked for his in return. "Miles," he said, then paused. Miles Turner. I don't know why, but hearing his full name made him feel real, grounded, like someone whose life existed beyond that small table and that cup of coffee. I smiled, and for the first time since that night, it wasn't forced. As weeks passed, our conversations grew longer. He asked about my dreams instead of my past, about where I wanted to go instead of where I came from. I told him I didn't know anymore, and he never laughed. He listened. That alone made him different from anyone I had ever known. Still, I kept a distance. Love had taught me to be careful. Family had taught me to expect pain. I wasn't ready to trust either again. One evening, after my shift ended, he offered to walk me home. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stay guarded. But something about his presence felt safe. We walked in silence for a while, the city glowing softly around us. When he asked why I flinched every time someone raised their voice, I almost told him everything. Almost. Instead, I said I had been through a lot. He nodded, as if that was enough for now. What I didn't know was that Miles was carrying his own secrets. I sensed it in the way he avoided certain questions, in the calls he never answered around me, in the weight behind his smile. Still, I found myself looking forward to his visits more than I wanted to admit. He made the days less heavy. He made me feel human again. The first time he touched my hand deliberately, not by accident, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gentle, careful, as if he was asking permission without words. I didn't pull away. In that moment, I realized how starved I was for kindness, how easily it could undo me. I went home that night terrified, not of him, but of how much I wanted to believe this could be real. As my feelings grew, so did my fear. I told myself stories never ended well for girls like me. Girls who were thrown away. Girls who loved too deeply. I promised myself I wouldn't fall. Even as my heart leaned closer with every shared laugh, every quiet confession. I didn't know yet that the hardest choices of my life were still ahead, or that loving Miles would eventually force me to confront the wounds my family had left behind. Because just when I began to feel safe, life reminded me that safety was never guaranteed. And the next truth I would uncover about Miles Turner would change everything I thought I knew about us. I found out the truth about Miles on a night when the city felt unusually quiet, as if it were holding its breath. We had been walking again, our steps slower than usual, neither of us in a hurry to reach the end of the street. I had just finished telling him about a childhood dream I no longer believed in, and he smiled in that distant way I had come to recognize as a warning. When his phone rang, he stopped walking. He looked at the screen, then at me. And for the first time since I met him, he didn't hide what crossed his face. Fear. Not the kind that startles, but the kind that weighs you down. He declined the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and said nothing. I didn't push. Silence had become our language. But something in the air shifted, and I knew whatever he was avoiding was about to collide with us. A few days later, I saw him differently. A black car pulled up outside the cafe, polished and out of place. I watched from behind the counter as Miles stepped out, dressed in a suit I had never seen him wear. He didn't notice me at first. He spoke briefly with the driver, his posture straight, controlled, like a man used to being obeyed. My chest tightened. This version of him didn't belong in my world of borrowed rooms and secondhand hope. When he walked inside and met my eyes, I saw panic flicker across his face. He knew I had seen. We didn't speak until my shift ended. When we finally sat across from each other, the space between us felt heavier than ever. He told me then, in a voice stripped of all pretense, that he hadn't lied to me, but he hadn't told me everything either. Miles Turner wasn't just a quiet man with a laptop and tired eyes. He was the heir to a company I had seen on billboards, the kind of name people associated with power and distance, not with warmth. He told me he hated that world, hated how it measured people by numbers and appearances. He came to that cafe because no one expected anything from him there, because with me, he could breathe. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Me, the girl who had been slapped and thrown out by her family, sitting across from a man whose life belonged in magazines. But the laughter never came. Instead, a familiar ache spread through my chest. I knew this story. I knew how it ended. People like him didn't choose people like me. They eventually returned to where they belonged, and left the rest of us with memories and regret. I told him I needed time. Not because I didn't care, but because caring suddenly felt dangerous. He understood. Or at least, he said he did. He didn't disappear, but something changed between us. His presence grew heavier, more cautious. My feelings, once simple and warm, became tangled with doubt and fear. Every smile felt temporary. Every touch felt like a goodbye waiting to happen. As weeks passed, the distance between our worlds became impossible to ignore. His calls came later at night. Mine went unanswered more often. When I asked where he had been, he said work. When I asked what he wanted, he said me. But his life told a different story. I began to wonder if loving him meant losing myself all over again. The breaking point came quietly. No arguments, no raised voices, just a realization settling into my bones. I was starting to disappear in my own life, shaping myself smaller to fit into the spaces he could offer. I remembered standing barefoot on the pavement years ago, promising myself I would never let anyone make me feel disposable again. So one night, with my heart pounding and my hands shaking, I told him I couldn't do this anymore. That loving him felt like waiting for the next slap, even if it never came. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with an expression that told me I had hurt him more deeply than he expected. I walked away before I could change my mind, before hope could betray me again. I told myself it was the right choice. I told myself survival sometimes meant leaving first. What I didn't know was that this goodbye would haunt us both for years, shaping every version of ourselves that followed. Walking away from Miles didn't feel brave. It felt like tearing something out of my chest with my own hands. For weeks after that night, I kept expecting to see him at the cafe, sitting in his usual corner, pretending not to wait for me. Every time the door opened, my heart jumped, then sank. He never came. The silence he left behind was louder than any argument we could have had. I threw myself into work, into exhaustion, into anything that kept me from thinking. I told myself I had made a mature decision, that loving him would have meant losing myself. But late at night, when the city softened and the noise faded, doubt crept in. I wondered if I had mistaken fear for intuition. I wondered if I had walked away not because I was strong, but because I was still that girl who believed she didn't deserve good things. Life moved forward without asking my permission. I found a better job, then another. I learned how to speak with confidence, how to sit in rooms without apologizing for my presence. The girl who had been thrown out barefoot slowly became someone people listened to. I didn't notice the transformation happening. It was only years later, looking back, that I realized I had been rebuilding myself piece by piece. My family remained a closed door. Birthdays passed without messages. Holidays came and went in quiet solitude. Sometimes I imagined them talking about me as if I were a bad decision they never wanted to revisit. Other times, I imagined they didn't talk about me at all. Both possibilities hurt in different ways. I learned to carry that absence like a scar hidden beneath my clothes. Miles stayed with me in ways I didn't expect. Not as a memory I replayed obsessively, but as a presence that shaped my choices. I measured men against the kindness he had shown me, against the way he had listened without trying to fix me. No one ever quite matched that. I dated, I smiled, I tried, but something in me remained guarded, as if my heart was still waiting for a danger that never arrived. Years passed. My life grew larger, fuller, more complex. I moved into an apartment I paid for myself, stood in front of mirrors without flinching, learned how to say no without guilt. People began to describe me with words like strong and impressive, and I smiled politely, never telling them how fragile I still felt inside. Strength, I learned, often grows from survival, not confidence. The day I saw Miles again was the day I realized some wounds don't fade quietly. I was attending a corporate event, standing among people in tailored suits and practiced smiles, when I heard his voice behind me. It was deeper, steadier, but unmistakable. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I froze. When I turned around, our eyes met, and the years between us collapsed into a single breath. He looked older, more composed, but his eyes were the same. Heavy, searching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world continued around us, unaware that two lives had just collided again after years of silence. He said my name like it still belonged to him. I answered with his, surprised that my voice didn't break. We exchanged polite words, careful smiles, as if we were strangers who hadn't once loved each other in the most vulnerable way possible. But beneath every sentence, there was something unspoken, vibrating with everything we had lost. That night, I went home shaking. I sat on my bed and realized I had never truly let him go. I had just learned how to live without him. Seeing him again reopened questions I thought I had buried forever. Questions about timing, about fear, about whether love missed its chance or simply waited for the right moment. I didn't know then that this reunion was only the beginning, that the life I had built so carefully was about to collide with my past in ways I couldn't control, and that soon, not just Miles, but my family too, would be forced to look at the woman I had become. After that night, I tried to convince myself that seeing Miles again had meant nothing. I told myself it was just coincidence, just a reminder of an old chapter that no longer defined me. But my body betrayed me every time his name crossed my mind. My sleep grew restless. My thoughts circled memories I had carefully avoided for years. I realized that time hadn't erased what we shared. It had only buried it under layers of survival. We began running into each other more often, though neither of us admitted it was intentional. Conferences, meetings, shared spaces that felt too precise to be accidental. Each encounter chipped away at the careful distance we tried to maintain. Our conversations stayed polite, professional, but our eyes spoke with a familiarity that made my chest ache. Every pause carried a question neither of us dared to ask. One evening, after a long event that left me emotionally drained, he walked beside me to the exit. The city lights reflected in the glass walls around us, turning everything unreal. He finally said what had been hovering between us for weeks. He told me he never stopped thinking about me. Not in the way people romanticize the past, but in the way unfinished stories linger quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. I listened, my heart pounding, unsure whether to feel comforted or afraid. I told him I had spent years learning how not to need anyone. That loving him once had taught me both how deep connection could go and how painful it was to lose it. He didn't interrupt. He never did. When I finished, he said something that shook me more than any apology could have. He said he had grown into the man he was because of losing me. That walking away from him had forced him to confront who he really was and what he wanted. That night, we didn't touch. We didn't promise anything. But something reopened between us. Fragile and uncertain. I went home aware that I was standing at the edge of a decision that could reshape my life again. I wondered if I was strong enough now to choose love without losing myself, or if some wounds were too deep to revisit. As our connection slowly deepened, the world around us began to notice. People looked at me differently. Whispers followed me through rooms I once felt invisible in. I didn't belong to those spaces before, but now I moved through them with a quiet confidence that surprised even me. I had earned my place, not through luck or attachment, but through resilience. That was when my family reappeared. It started with a message from my mother, brief and cautious, as if she were testing whether I still existed. She said she had heard about my success, that she was proud, that she hoped I was well. The words felt foreign, rehearsed. I stared at the screen for a long time, my hands trembling. Years of silence reduced to a few polite sentences. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done. More messages followed. From my father. From relatives who had watched me leave and done nothing. They asked to meet. They spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of love expressed poorly. I felt the old ache rise inside me, the familiar instinct to shrink, to forgive too quickly. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I had built myself without them. I had learned how to stand alone. When I told Miles about it, he didn't tell me what to do. He only asked how I felt. I realized then how different this love was from anything I had known before. It didn't demand sacrifice. It didn't require silence. It offered space. Still, the idea of facing my family again filled me with dread. I didn't know if I wanted closure, confrontation, or distance. I only knew the past was no longer willing to stay buried. And as the date for that meeting approached, I felt the weight of every version of myself pressing against my chest. The girl who was slapped and thrown out, and the woman standing on her own now, both waiting to see which one would speak first. I agreed to meet my family on a gray afternoon that felt too heavy for coincidence. I chose a quiet restaurant, neutral ground, a place where emotions would have to lower their voices. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because waiting at home felt unbearable. As I sat there, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, I tried to steady my breathing. I reminded myself that I was no longer 22. I was no longer defenseless. They arrived together as if presenting a united front. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes searching my face for something familiar. My father avoided my gaze at first, then nodded stiffly when our eyes met. We exchanged greetings that felt like lines from a poorly rehearsed play. Polite, careful, empty. They spoke first, about how hard those years had been, about mistakes made in anger, about love that had always been there, even if it hadn't looked like it. I listened without interrupting, my chest tightening with every word. When my mother finally reached for my hand, I flinched before I could stop myself. The gesture froze her in place. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. I told them what they had never allowed me to say. I spoke about that night, about the slap, about the cold pavement, about the years spent believing I was unlovable. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me most of all. I wasn't there to beg for understanding. I was there to tell the truth. My father's face crumpled as I spoke. My mother cried quietly, her tears finally matching the pain she had caused. They apologized then. Not perfectly, not completely, but sincerely enough to crack something open inside me. Still, I didn't offer forgiveness easily. I told them I needed time. That reconciliation wasn't something they could demand just because my life now looked respectable. They nodded, humbled, regret etched into every movement. When we parted, I felt lighter, not because everything was healed, but because I had reclaimed my voice. Miles was waiting outside when I left, leaning against his car, giving me space until I reached him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need answers. He just opened his arms, and for the first time in years, I let myself be held without fear. In that moment, I realized how far I had come. I was no longer defined by rejection. I was defined by choice. Our relationship didn't rush forward after that. It unfolded slowly, deliberately. We talked about everything we had avoided before: fear, power, vulnerability, timing. Loving him now felt different. It felt grounded, equal. We weren't trying to save each other. We were choosing each other. When he asked me to marry him, it wasn't grand or public. It was quiet, private, and honest. He told me he loved the woman I had become, not despite my past, but because of it. I said yes with tears in my eyes, not from pain this time, but from recognition. I had survived. I had grown. I had found love that didn't hurt. News of our engagement spread quickly. My family heard through others before I told them myself. When we finally spoke, their congratulations were careful, weighted with humility. They looked at me differently now. Not as a disappointment, but as someone they feared losing again. The regret in their eyes was undeniable. Standing beside Miles on our wedding day, I thought about the girl on the pavement years ago. I wished I could tell her that she would be okay, that she would build a life so full it would make the pain worth surviving, that the people who hurt her would one day have to face the woman she became. Some stories end with revenge. Mine ended with something quieter: acceptance, strength, love earned slowly and protected fiercely. I didn't need my family's approval to feel whole anymore, but seeing their regret reminded me of one simple truth. They had thrown me away when I was most vulnerable, and I had become the woman they regretted losing. Even after the wedding, the echoes of my past didn't disappear overnight. Healing, I learned, is not a straight line. Some mornings I woke up beside Miles and felt an unexpected wave of sadness, as if my body was remembering things my mind no longer needed. Other mornings I felt an overwhelming gratitude so strong it almost scared me. Life had given me more than I once believed I deserved, and I was still learning how to hold it without fear. Marriage didn't erase who we were. It revealed us more clearly. Miles never tried to shield me from the world, and I never asked him to dim his light for mine. We stood side by side, not above or behind each other. Love, when it's healthy, doesn't demand proof. It offers presence. In quiet moments, I realized that what I felt for him wasn't the desperate attachment I once confused with love, but something steadier, something that trusted tomorrow. My family tried, in their own imperfect way, to be part of my life again. Invitations, messages, careful conversations that avoided the past unless I brought it up. I allowed them close, but not inside the parts of me they once shattered. Boundaries became my quiet victory. They learned that access to me was no longer automatic. It was earned through respect. I could see the regret in their eyes whenever they looked at me. Not because of my success, but because they finally understood what they had almost lost forever. There was one moment, months later, that stayed with me. My mother pulled me aside during a family gathering, her voice trembling as she asked how I had survived without them. I told her the truth. I survived because I had no other choice. Because pain either breaks you or teaches you how strong you are. She cried then, not loudly, but with the kind of sorrow that comes too late. I held her, not as the daughter seeking comfort, but as the woman who no longer needed permission to heal. Sometimes I think about that night on the pavement, about the cold, the fear, the humiliation. I don't relive it with anger anymore. I see it as the beginning of my becoming. Losing my family forced me to find myself. Being loved properly taught me how to stay. And regret, I learned, belongs to those who choose cruelty over compassion. If there's one truth my story carries, it's this. Being thrown away does not mean you are worthless. Sometimes it means you were in the wrong hands. I didn't rise to prove anyone wrong. I rose because I refused to disappear. And the life I built became the quiet answer to every slap, every silence, every closed door. I am Evelyn Ross. I was once discarded. And I became a woman no one could ignore, not because of who I married, but because of who I chose to be. This is not a story about revenge. It is a story about survival, love, and the kind of strength that grows in silence.